A 9-year-old Yazidi girl named Nadia Murad watched ISIS fighters drag her mother away before loading her onto a bus with dozens of other terrified children. What happened next was part of a system so brutal, so methodically organized that it would later be classified as genocide by the United Nations. But this wasn't an isolated incident or the work of rogue extremists. This was the continuation of a practice that had been refined and perfected across 14 centuries of Islamic conquest. From the earliest caliphates to the modern horrors of ISIS, the systematic sexual enslavement of captured women represents one of the darkest chapters in human history. Yet, it's a story that's been sanitized, ignored, or dismissed as enemy propaganda. What you're about to discover comes from documented historical sources, survivor testimonies, and archaeological evidence that reveals how Islamic caliphates transformed the rape and enslavement of women into a religious institution that shaped medieval civilization and continues to influence the world today. The evidence is so disturbing that many historians initially refused to believe it. From the Abbasid harems where thousands of captured women were cataloged like livestock, to Ottoman Devrim raids that tore children from Christian families, to the modern ISIS slave markets where Yazidi girls were sold with price tags around their necks. These weren't random acts of wartime violence. They were calculated systems of control that used sexual terror as a weapon of conquest, more effective than any army. The theological justification came directly from the Quran itself. Verse 424 explicitly permits sexual relations with captive women, while verse 33-50 refers to women possessed by the right hand as legitimate spoils of war. This wasn't interpretation or extremist distortion. This was foundational Islamic law that created a legal framework for the systematic sexual exploitation of conquered populations. When Muslim armies swept across the Byzantine Empire, Persia, and North Africa, they didn't just conquer territory. They harvested human beings. Women and children were classified as Sabaya war captives, whose bodies became the rightful property of their Muslim conquerors. The process was methodical and bureaucratic. Captured women were divided into categories based on their age, beauty, and perceived value. The most attractive were reserved for high-ranking commanders and ultimately the caliph himself. The remainder were distributed among the soldiers or sold in slave markets that operated across the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate perfected this system into an institution that would serve as the template for Islamic empires for the next 1,000 years. The Abbasid harem wasn't just a collection of wives and concubines. It was a carefully organized hierarchy of sexual slavery that housed thousands of women in conditions that would make modern human traffickers envious. Persian historian Wasaf documented how conquering armies swept through cities like hungry falcons attacking a flight of doves, describing how those hiding behind the veils of the great harem were dragged through the streets and alleys, each of them becoming a plaything as the population died at the hands of the invaders. The acquisition process was brutal and efficient. Young girls of extraordinary beauty were sent to the caliph's court as gifts from provincial governors. Others were purchased from slave markets after being kidnapped from their families or sold by impoverished parents. Caucasian, Georgian, and Abkhazian women were particularly prized, with entire regions becoming hunting grounds for slave traders who supplied the Islamic world with fresh captives. But the system required more than just the capture and enslavement of women. It required the complete destruction of their previous identities and the construction of new ones designed for sexual submission. Captured women underwent a process of psychological breaking that began the moment they were taken. They were stripped naked, examined for virginity, and evaluated based on their potential value as sexual commodities. Those who resisted were beaten or killed as examples to the others. The role of eunuchs in this system reveals its calculated cruelty. These were men, often prisoners of war or purchased slaves, who were castrated before puberty and condemned to lifelong servitude as guards and administrators of the harem. The castration process, performed without anesthesia by Jewish or Christian practitioners, since Islamic law prohibited Muslims from performing the procedure while allowing them to benefit from its results, killed the majority of boys who underwent it. Those who survived faced lives of physical and psychological torment, forever denied the possibility of normal human relationships, while serving as instruments of oppression against the women they guarded. The Ottoman Empire expanded the system to an industrial scale through the devrim, a practice that involved the systematic kidnapping of Christian boys from conquered territories. Ottoman officials explained the practice with chilling directness. The conquered are slaves of the conquerors, to whom their goods, their women, and their children belong as lawful possession. Boys as young as 4 were torn from their families, forced to convert to Islam, and trained to serve the Ottoman state. The psychological trauma inflicted on Christian communities was immense, with traditional folk songs preserving the anguish of parents who watched their children disappear into the Islamic system. You catch and shackle the old and the arch-priests in order to take the children as janissaries. Their parents weep, and their sisters and brothers too, and I cry until it pains me. The devrim represented a violation of Islamic law itself, as it broke the dhimmi protection supposedly guaranteed to people of the book. But the practical benefits to the Ottoman state outweighed religious considerations. By destroying Christian family structures and converting their children into loyal Muslim soldiers and administrators, the Ottomans created a self-perpetuating system of conquest and control. Christian communities developed desperate strategies of resistance. Parents married their sons at impossibly young ages to make them ineligible for conscription. Priests removed names from parish registries to hide the existence of boys. Families fled their homes to avoid the recruiters. Some communities resorted to murdering Ottoman officials or attempting to bribe them. But the system was too well organized and too profitable to be stopped by local resistance. The scope of this human trafficking network was staggering. Archaeological evidence from medieval Islamic cities reveals slave markets that operated like modern shopping centers, with specialized sections for different types of human merchandise. Children were displayed naked on platforms while potential buyers examined their bodies like livestock. Children were separated from their mothers and sold to buyers with specific requirements. The most beautiful women commanded prices equivalent to small fortunes, while older or less attractive captives were sold in bulk to brothel operators or agricultural estates. The psychological impact on the women trapped in this system was devastating and intentional. They were forbidden from maintaining connections to their previous lives, their families, their religions, or their cultures. They were given new names, forced to learn Arabic, and required to convert to Islam. Those who refused faced punishment that ranged from beatings to execution. The successful ones learned to perform gratitude for their enslavement, expressing joy at being chosen to serve their Muslim masters. The legal framework supporting this system was comprehensive and detailed. Islamic jurisprudence developed elaborate rules governing the treatment of female slaves, including when they could be sexually used, how their children should be classified, and under what circumstances they might eventually be freed. But these laws were designed to protect the interests of slave owners, not the women themselves. Female slaves had no right to refuse sexual advances from their masters. They could be raped repeatedly without legal recourse. If they became pregnant, their children would be considered legitimate if acknowledged by the father, but the women themselves remained property. They could be sold, given away, or killed at their owner's discretion. The only protection they had was their economic value, which provided a small incentive for owners to keep them alive and relatively healthy. The breeding programs developed by some Islamic rulers revealed the systematic nature of this exploitation. Captured women were selected based on their potential to produce children with desirable characteristics. They were forced to mate with specific men chosen by their owners, creating bloodlines of slaves bred for particular purposes. Some were bred for beauty to serve in harems. Others were bred for strength to work in fields or households. The children of these unions inherited their mother's slave status, creating generations of people born into sexual servitude. This system wasn't hidden or practiced in secret. It was celebrated in Islamic literature, praised by religious scholars, and documented by historians as a natural and beneficial aspect of Islamic conquest. The great Islamic historian Ibn Khaldun wrote approvingly of the civilizing effects of sexual slavery, arguing that it brought barbarous women into contact with superior Islamic culture. Religious scholars produced detailed treatises on the proper treatment of female slaves, with elaborate discussions of sexual techniques and breeding strategies. The economic impact of this trade was enormous. The wealth generated by slave trading helped fund the expansion of Islamic empires and the construction of their great architectural monuments. The Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, the palaces of Baghdad, and the mosques of Cairo were built with profits from human trafficking. The Islamic Golden Age, that produced advances in mathematics, medicine, and philosophy, was subsidized by the systematic sexual exploitation of conquered populations. But the most insidious aspect of this system was how it normalized sexual violence as a tool of religious and political control. By making rape a religious duty and sexual slavery a divine reward, Islamic law created a feedback loop that incentivized conquest and brutality. Warriors were promised access to beautiful captive women as payment for their service. Governors and administrators were awarded with harems stocked with the most attractive slaves. The entire Islamic social hierarchy was built on the sexual exploitation of conquered peoples. The documentation of these practices comes from Islamic sources themselves. Court records, legal treatises, historical chronicles, and administrative documents provide detailed evidence of how this system operated. These weren't accusations made by enemies of Islam. They were proud records kept by the perpetrators themselves, who saw nothing shameful in their actions because they were sanctioned by their religion and profitable for their empires. Modern ISIS didn't invent sexual slavery. They simply revived and modernized a practice that had been central to Islamic conquest for over a millennium. When ISIS fighters published pamphlets explaining their treatment of Yazidi women, they cited the same Quranic verses and the same historical precedents that had justified similar actions by the Abbasids, the Ottomans, and countless other Islamic rulers throughout history. The Yazidi genocide of 2014 wasn't an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of 14 centuries of institutionalized sexual slavery that began with the earliest Islamic conquests and continued through every major caliphate until the present day. When ISIS fighters separated Yazidi women from their children and loaded them onto buses bound for slave markets, they were following procedures that had been refined across generations of Islamic rulers. The process was identical to what had happened countless times before. Captured women were stripped naked and examined by ISIS doctors who tested them for virginity and evaluated their reproductive potential. The youngest and most attractive were tagged with price labels and transported to Raqqa, the self-proclaimed capital of the Islamic State. There they were displayed in public markets where fighters bid on them like livestock. A 12-year-old Yazidi girl who survived the ordeal described how her ISIS captor would pray before and after raping her, viewing his sexual assault as a means of drawing closer to God. This wasn't the twisted interpretation of a single extremist. This was standard ISIS doctrine, published in their official magazine, Dabiq, and distributed to fighters as religious instruction. The rape of non-Muslim women was presented as both a religious duty and a spiritual reward for faithful service to the Caliphate. ISIS didn't hide their revival of sexual slavery. They celebrated it. Their propaganda magazines featured detailed theological justifications for the practice, complete with citations from classical Islamic legal texts. They published price lists for different categories of female slaves. They created bureaucratic systems for registering ownership and tracking the movement of captive women between different ISIS territories. The systematic nature of IS's sexual slavery mirrored the administrative efficiency of historical Islamic empires. Every captured woman was catalogued and assigned an identification number. Their ownership was officially registered with ISIS authorities, making escape nearly impossible since any checkpoint would immediately identify runaway slaves and return them to their owners. The few women who managed to escape described a network of Arab and Kurdish smugglers who initially freed an average of 134 captives per month until ISIS crackdowns reduced rescue operations and fighters began targeting the smugglers themselves. The theological framework ISIS used to justify these atrocities was identical to what Islamic scholars had used for centuries. They cited the same Quranic verses about women possessed by the right hand. They referenced the same hadith describing how the Prophet Muhammad's companions took female captives as concubines after military victories. They quoted the same legal opinions from medieval Islamic jurists who had codified the rules governing sexual slavery. Modern apologists claim these practices represent a distortion of true Islam. But the historical record tells a different story. The systematic sexual enslavement of conquered women wasn't a deviation from Islamic law. It was the practical application of Islamic law as understood and implemented by every major Islamic empire throughout history. The Abbasid caliphs who built harems housing thousands of captive women weren't violating Islamic principles, they were following them. The Ottoman sultans who institutionalized the kidnapping of Christian children weren't corrupting their faith, they were expressing it. The ISIS fighters who raped 9-year-old girls weren't betraying Islamic teachings, they were implementing them. The continuity between historical Islamic sexual slavery and modern ISIS practices reveals something fundamental about the nature of these atrocities. They weren't products of medieval barbarism or modern extremism. They were the logical outcomes of a religious and legal system that explicitly permits and encourages the sexual exploitation of conquered populations. The survivors of these systems carry scars that extend far beyond physical trauma. They represent millions of women whose lives were destroyed by an institution that treated rape as a religious sacrament and sexual slavery as a divine reward. Their stories have been systematically suppressed, ignored, or dismissed as propaganda by historians unwilling to confront the full scope of these atrocities. But the evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Court records, administrative documents, legal treatises, and survivor testimonies create a historical record that spans 14 centuries and encompasses millions of victims. The sexual enslavement of conquered women wasn't an unfortunate side effect of Islamic expansion. It was a central feature of Islamic conquest, a deliberate strategy that used sexual terror to break the will of conquered populations and reward the loyalty of Muslim fighters. The transformation of rape into a religious duty and sexual slavery into a divine blessing represents one of the most systematic forms of institutionalized violence in human history. It created a feedback loop of conquest and exploitation that shaped the development of Islamic civilization and left scars that persist to this day. The women and children who suffered under these systems deserve to have their stories told without sanitization or apology. They deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to the rise of Islamic empires, but as human beings whose lives were destroyed by a system that valued their bodies more than their humanity. The legacy of Islamic sexual slavery extends far beyond the historical victims. It established precedents and created legal frameworks that continue to influence attitudes toward women in Islamic societies today. The same theological arguments used to justify the enslavement of Byzantine princesses and Yazidi children continue to shape discussions about women's rights, consent, and bodily autonomy across the Islamic world. Understanding this history isn't about promoting hatred or prejudice. It's about confronting the full scope of human cruelty and recognizing how religious and political systems can be used to justify the most horrific forms of exploitation. Only by acknowledging these atrocities in their full historical context can we hope to prevent their repetition and honor the memory of the millions of women and children who suffered under systems that treated sexual violence as a sacred duty. The story of Islamic sexual slavery is ultimately a story about power, control, and the systematic dehumanization of conquered populations. It reveals how religious authority can be weaponized to justify the most brutal forms of exploitation and how entire civilizations can be built on foundations of institutionalized violence. These aren't comfortable truths, but they are necessary ones. The voices of the victims demand to be heard, and their suffering demands to be acknowledged. Only by facing this history can we begin to understand how human beings are capable of such systematic cruelty and what it takes to build societies that protect, rather than exploit, the vulnerable.